In the lingering heat of the Indian frontier, as Alexander's army marched westward with weary steps, a shadow began to follow them, one that no sword could cut down, no strategy could outmaneuver. It was the shadow of fate. Alexander rode at the head of his troops, but something inside him felt different. The relentless fire that once pushed him across continents was flickering, not extinguished, but wounded. The Hephaestion decision still echoed in his mind. For the first time in his life, Alexander had turned back, not because of defeat, but because of something far heavier, the hearts of his men. As the army crossed Iran's scorched plains and followed the long dust roads toward Babylon, the world around them seemed to shift. The drums of triumph were fading, even the sky hung heavy, as if the gods themselves waited for what would come next. But destiny, as always, struck from where Alexander least expected. Hephaestion, his companion, his friend, the man who had ridden with him since boyhood, who shared his victories, his secrets, his burdens. Even during the Indian campaign, Hephaestion's health had been fragile. The humid rainforests of Punjab had weakened him. The long marches drained what little strength remained. Yet he never complained, not once. He stood beside Alexander every day, hiding the trembling in his hands, the pallor on his face, the breath that came shorter with each passing dawn. It was in the ancient Persian city of Ecbatana that fate finally sharpened its blade. The city seemed peaceful at first. Alexander ordered festivals, sacrifices to the gods, and grand athletic games, hoping to raise the morale of his exhausted army. Music echoed through the halls, wine flowed freely, and the scent of burning incense drifted across the marble courtyards. But in the midst of celebration, Hephaestion collapsed. At first, it seemed like exhaustion. Then fever consumed him. His body grew cold, then burned like fire. The palace healers rushed to his side, but their medicines did nothing. Word spread through the city like a silent storm. Alexander rushed to Hephaestion's chamber. When he entered, the room was dim, lit only by oil lamps that flickered weakly, as if afraid of what they witnessed. Hephaestion lay on a thin bed, his breath shallow, his face pale. Alexander knelt beside him and took his hand. "You have been with me from the beginning," he whispered, voice cracking. "From Pella to the ends of the earth. Don't leave me now, not here, not when there is still more to do." Hephaestion tried to speak, but his lips trembled without sound. Alexander dismissed the physicians, furious at their helplessness. He paced the room, shouting, demanding remedies that did not exist, blaming the gods, blaming fate, blaming himself. But as the hours passed, the fever only grew stronger. Near sunset, Hephaestion's breath slowed. Alexander stood over him, eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. And then the breath stopped. The world fell silent. The man who marched with Alexander through every conquest, the man he trusted beyond every general and advisor, the man he called Phil Alexandrus, the friend of Alexander, was gone. When the palace attendants stepped forward to cover Hephaestion's body, Alexander roared like a wounded lion. He pushed them away, collapsing over his friend's chest, clutching him with shaking hands. The conqueror of the world, the king of kings, the man who defied empires, wept. The entire palace stood still. No general dared approach him. For 3 days, Alexander neither ate nor slept. He refused to leave the chamber where Hephaestion lay. When he finally emerged, something in him had changed. His face looked older, harder, hollow. And then came the storm. Alexander ordered every horse in the city stables to have their manes cut short, a symbol of mourning reserved only for royal tragedies. He banned all music. He commanded a public mourning throughout the empire. He executed the physician who failed to save Hephaestion and tore down the walls of Ecbatana's fortress in grief. But even this was not enough. Alexander declared that Hephaestion would receive a funeral equal to a hero, a demigod, a son of Achilles himself. He sent messengers across Asia, ordering sacrifices, statues, shrines, and temples. He planned a pyre so massive that witnesses would speak of it for centuries. Hephaestion, he said, would be worshipped as a god. And as the preparations began, Alexander returned to leading his army, though he now moved like a man carrying stone weights on his soul. From Ecbatana, he marched toward Babylon, the beating heart of his empire. He dreamed of new conquests, Arabia, Carthage, perhaps even beyond. But the dreams were hollow now, like echoes in an empty chamber. Without Hephaestion, the world no longer felt like a prize worth taking. Babylon awaited him with open gates. Its walls shimmered with blue tiles, its markets buzzed with life, and the great Euphrates flowed calmly beneath the bridges. But there were omens. Black ravens circled the sky. Priests whispered warnings of ill fortune. Even the royal astrologers urged him not to enter the city. But Alexander, who never listened to fear, marched in anyway. The city erupted in celebration. Feasts were held, animals were sacrificed, musicians filled the air with song, and foreign ambassadors lined up to greet the king who ruled from Greece to India. Yet even amid the fanfare, Alexander felt the weight of absence at his side. Each empty seat at the banquet reminded him of the laughter that used to sit there. Each victory toast reminded him of the one friend whose cup would never rise again. Slowly, exhaustion began to creep into his body. He ignored it at first. A cough, a headache, a slight fever. He had suffered worse on battlefields. But the fever worsened. His voice grew hoarse. His strength faltered. He struggled to rise from bed. His generals begged him to rest, but Alexander remained defiant. He attended meetings, inspected plans for new campaigns, and even oversaw naval construction on the Euphrates. Yet the sickness tightened its grip. One night, during a banquet, he felt the room spin. He gripped the edge of the table, breath shallow, vision narrowing. His body trembled with heat. He returned to his quarters, and there the fever surged. He collapsed onto his bed, teeth clenched, sweat covering his skin. The palace healers were summoned. They whispered to one another in panic. They brought herbs, oils, wines, prayers. Nothing worked. Within days, Alexander lost his voice. He could no longer speak. He could only gesture. One by one, his generals entered the dimly lit chamber. The air hung heavy with incense, fear, and something else, an unbearable grief. Alexander saw each of them, his eyes glowing with a desperate, fading fire. They leaned down to hear him. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He pointed to his ring, the royal signet of the empire. Then he pointed to his generals. It was a message. The empire would be left to the strongest. The room froze. No name, no heir, only a challenge that would ignite wars for decades. The next morning, his soldiers, thousands of them, marched past his chamber to see him one last time. They filed through the room in silent waves, touching his hand, bowing their heads, whispering farewells to the king who led them to the ends of the world. Some wept openly, some stood frozen, some knelt and kissed his sheets. Alexander, barely conscious, lifted his hand weakly to acknowledge them. It was the final gesture of the greatest commander in history. That night, as Babylon's torches flickered against the palace walls, Alexander's breath grew shallow. His pulse weakened. The fever burned, until it flickered into nothing. Then, in the darkness of a warm June night in 323 BC, Alexander the Great, the man who crossed continents, shattered empires, and bent history itself, took his final breath. He was 32 years old. The world changed forever. Empires would rise and fall. Generals would battle for his throne. Cities would fight for his memory. But there would never again be a man like Alexander. Hephaestion waited for him in the realm beyond, and together they walked into immortality. End of Part 10. Part 11 will cover the Empire Division, Diachi Wars, Perdiccas, Seleucus, Ptolemy, and the Legacy phase.